Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, I very much agreed with what Paul was saying earlier on this. The era of COVID, everything being done online. It's a great opportunity to participate in more conferences, but it's also the human element is obviously absent. So what I want to speak about today was geography or geopolitics and Russia, because when we speak of geopolitics, it's very hard to divorce it from geography, and I think the geography of Russia has definitely shaped much of its politics today. So yes, we all know Russia considers Kiev and Rus to be the cradle of its civilization, in which they were considered to be a regular European country. That is, it was a maritime power located on the Dnieper River, which connected it to the Byzantine Empire in the south and the Vikings in the north. So again, a regular maritime European state or nation. And it was when this dissolved and they were invaded by the Mongols in the 13th century, this is when it took a different path, being isolated to a large extent from the rest of the Europeans. And we saw a lot of this being attempted to be reversed in the early 18th century with Peter the Great defeating the Swedes and making Russia a maritime power in the Barents Sea, the Baltic Sea, and this is when Russia considered itself to have returned to Europe to become a maritime power again, and this is also why they pursued Europeanization, that is actual cultural revolution, to get rid of their Eastern identity and instead become more European. And for the next 300 years, I would argue that Russia has, to a large extent, had a very Western-centric foreign policy for this exact reason, that if you want to be connected to the world, you had to connect to the seas, you had to align yourself closer with the Europeans, to modernize, to pursue economic development. And so this was, again, since 1721 until almost the present day, has been what's been driving a lot of Russian foreign policy. And then for the same reason, the countries who have been seeking to contain Russia, be it the dominant maritime power, the British, the Americans, if you want to weaken Russia, then of course you want to cut off their access to the seas. So this is why maritime containment has always been quite important. And so this whole Western-centric foreign policy was already challenged in the 19th century. People are familiar with Dostoevsky argument that perhaps we should look more towards the east because we are never going to be welcomed in Europe. And then you had actual politicians and economists pushing the idea that perhaps Russia should look for economic opportunities in the east. So this when you had the Siberian railroads, you had Sergei Witte attempting to connect Russia with Asia instead of only being too reliant on the Europeans. And this was, again, on the other side of this coin, the countries who wanted to isolate Russia. If we saw the Crimean War in the mid-19th century, the key objective of the British, the French, was obviously, as is stated quite openly, was to defeat the Russians in Crimea, to push them back into Asia, as the Mongols had done, and make them, cancel their role as it is, as a European power. This is to make them backward, not economically competitive, and disconnected from the wider world. So this is again why Ukraine has a key role for the countries who want to contain Russia, but also for Russia if you want to stay connected to Europe. Now, I would say that after the Cold War, Yeltsin tried to position himself as another Peter the Great. That is, he wanted to renounce the Eastern history, so reject or not cancel, but abandon a lot of its partnerships with China, Central Asia, and other former Soviet republics because they only wanted to focus on the West. They were going to become more European. And this, of course, built on the policies of Gorbachev, so this common European home in which we would abandon these military blocks from the Cold War and we would instead construct a common Europe. So again, a very 1,000-year-old theme for the Russians, that is to find their place in Europe. And for Yeltsin, he thought this would be more possible to achieve than under Gorbachev, because for Yeltsin, he could say, we embrace democracy, market capitalism. Surely there's no more ideological dividing lines that would justify keeping us out. However, as we saw, the West, we did not take yes for an answer, as they made themselves excessively dependent on the West. They became weakened, and there was an opportunity then to create a Europe without Russia. So again, also a common historical theme. And but nonetheless, the Russians continued this goal of trying to pursue gradual integration with the Europeans. But all of this came to a grinding halt in 2014. This is when the Western countries toppled the government in Ukraine, and the obvious objective was to make Ukraine into a front line rather than having it as a bridge between the East and West. So this is something that I argue disrupted or ended 300 years of Russia's Western-centric foreign policy. Because by attempting to cut off the Russians again from Ukraine and push them back into Asia, this is not, in the past, again, in the mid-19th century, this would have made Russia backward, disconnected it from the world. But as we saw in 2014, this happened to be the same time when China was challenging America's leadership over the dominant technologies. They began to connect the world with the Belt and Road Initiative. They developed new development banks, currencies, the use of different currencies, establishing new payment systems. Overall, a new economic architecture was built in the East. So instead of pushing the Russians into no man's land, we saw that they were pushing Russia closer towards China and the East. So for me, this is also, when I started to look at this concept of Greater Eurasia, because in 2014, I argued that Greater Europe initiative effectively died, and the Russians began to pursue what they call the Greater Eurasia Initiative. So indeed, I wrote a book in 2015, what I argued would be the systemic incentives for Russia, what kind of political economy it would have for Greater Eurasia. And I asked Putin's advisor for Eurasia, Sergei Karaganov, to if he would write a forward. And at the end, he wrote a forward, and I was also offered a position in Moscow. So this is what I worked on for a while when I was professor at the Higher School of Economics, which was what would be Russia's economic structures for this Greater Eurasia Initiative. That is, not only look towards Asia, but also not only look towards Europe, but also diversify its economic connectivity, begin to look more also to China, India, and other countries on this vast continent. And again, for Russia, this had an obvious opportunity, as many Russian scholars discussed in the 19th century. That is, instead of being at the periphery of these economic regions, be it Europe or Asia, where Russia sits on the outside of both regions, it would have an interest in instead remove itself from a dual periphery and instead position itself at the center of an integrated Eurasian continent. And this fit well with China's objective, which is the real economic locomotive, as it also has these objectives to connect the Eurasian landmass by technologies, industries, physical connectivity with its railroads, ports, and of course financial as well. So suddenly Russia found China to be its main partner in this ambition to create a greater Eurasia. So again, this was in the 1920s. This was seen by people like Trubetskoy as a way to embrace Russia's geography. This should be its key geopolitics. That is, it has advantages from being a Eurasian state as opposed to being simply at the periphery of Europe. And so in this new format, in the past, the Russians looked towards Germany to be its main partner to construct a greater Europe, the main two economic centers, the largest two European powers. But again, the countries who wanted to contain Russia always had an interest in preventing them from cooperating. So again, the border region being then countries like Ukraine, which there's always an incentive for the US and UK historically to use to disrupt or disconnect these two countries. Nord Stream being blown up. It's too many border regions which can't be controlled. The benefit with China is obviously they share a border. There's no neighboring countries which can be used to sabotage this relationship. Also, if Germany is the industrial might or industrial power of Europe, or at least it used to be, then China is, Germany on steroids. It's a much greater country. This, of course, is an advantage to Russia. This gives them a partner to reorganize the international economic architecture and reorganize the world away from this US-led economic system and instead create a multipolar economic system. But it also has a challenge. That is, China is obviously much more powerful economically than the Russians. And for this reason, if they only connect with China, then will essentially allow their pivot to Asia to become simply a pivot to China, then it would be a very asymmetrical relationship. They would be the little brother. Again, this is not just about status or pride, but if you're too dependent on one state which is much more powerful than you, so you're more dependent on them than they are on you, this usually translates into diminished sovereignty, reduced influence, and the things Russia always takes very serious. Given, again, its huge territory, sovereignty becomes a very sacred issue. So they then had to begin to find a way of harmonizing their interest with the Chinese. And Central Asia was seemingly a tense point for the both of them because they both had a strategic interest in Central Asia. But as we saw, the Russians, much like the Chinese, are an indispensable ally to the Russians. The Russians are also an important ally to the Chinese. If you want to connect the Eurasian landmass, you can't really do it without the Russians. So for this reason, they were able to harmonize their strategic interests. We saw the Russians pursuing or developing this Eurasian Economic Union with the Central Asians to have more collective bargaining power vis-a-vis the Chinese, a bit like what the EU was supposed to be, that is collective bargaining power, so we will have more equality or parity with the United States. The Russians pursued the same logic with the Eurasian Economic Union, and instead of ending up in a zero-sum rivalry, as we have in Europe, obviously, they looked for a way to harmonize this. So the Eurasian Economic Union, led by Russia, has been harmonized with the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese, and they do this under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We also see that the Russians, seeking to diversify, that is, to have many partners in the East. So they're also pursuing this Russia, Iran, India, international north-south transportation corridor, which is then linked up with supply chains, technological cooperation. And yet again, they discovered that the Chinese did not try to sabotage relations between the Russians and the Indians. Instead, the Russians were, or the Chinese were quite comfortable with the Russian diversifying, because this essentially created a format for Greater Eurasia, in which Russia accepted that China would be the leading economy, but it would not allow China to dominate. And this has been, I think, also part of the logic of expanding the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or even the BRICS Club. That is, if you take in more and more members, then the Chinese will still be the largest one, but they can't dominate. And because the Chinese haven't yet expressed any interest in hegemony, that is to replace the US as the only center of power, they haven't made any problems with this. So now we see also the Arctic being pushed under this Eurasian format for the Russians. That is, all the other Arctic states happen now to be NATO countries, and we don't work with Russia. We consider them an enemy. And the Arctic Council even suspended cooperation with the Russians. So for this reason, they're now inviting other countries, be it China, India, United Arab Emirates, non-Arctic states, to help them develop the Arctic. We saw the same logic before the war, at least, with Japan and South Korea, India, all of these countries. They didn't want Russia to get too dependent only on China, so they have an incentive now to reach out to Russia to form different cooperation. Again, even the Japanese, they didn't used to want to work with the Russians because they wanted to solve first the the problem of the Northern Kuril Islands, as they have a territorial dispute. As Russia began to lean towards China, they also recognized it's in our interest not the Russians to be too dependent on China, because then the Russians will take China's side in any disputes with Japan. So everything was turned on its head. While in Europe we have the historical baggage and Russia's too big to fit, our first impulse is always to contain Russia, to confront it. In Asia, they discovered the opposite, that they're instead being accommodated by often what is more dynamic economies. And this is why now the main goal forward, as world leaders are now meeting in Kazan in Russia, they are now trying to develop the BRICS to have accept more members, look at how they can use this to facilitate these new supply chains, develop grain corridor, technological cooperation between the different hubs, all this physical connectivity with new railroads, roads, maritime roads, and also, of course, looking for developing digital payment systems, new development banks, and create an economic infrastructure for a multipolar world. So this is the geopolitical direction of Russia, and I think this has to be seen in the context of the war in Ukraine, because Russia sees it now as positioned in a very important historical point. That is, it's finally seen to break free of the American-led economic system, which is seen to be the successor of the imperial system of the Europeans, in which there's one center of power which dominates the rest of the world. So there's a lot of reasons why the Russians can be optimistic about the future. Indeed, in the West, we rarely ask ourselves, how can it be that we put all the sanctions we possibly could on the Russians, and still they're now one of the fastest growing economies in Europe? How can they be the fourth largest economy, according to the World Bank, in terms of purchasing power parity, while the main economy in Europe, Germany, is now in decline? So if you want to understand this, I think it has to be seen through the prism of Russia now embracing its geography and pursuing, essentially the geopolitics it was meant to lead, which is that of that embraces its geography of Eurasia, and this also explains why this idea that if we expand NATO into Ukraine to try to break Russia, that this is and go back to this way we had it in the 90s. This is unacceptable to the Russians. They consider this for very good reason to be an existential threat. And there's simply no way that NATO can defeat Russia, because for Russia, they have everything on the line here. So I think that the Ukraine war is a key reason why we ended up in this situation, why Russia abandoned effectively this Greater Europe initiative. But it's also now become a key conflict to diversify and to accommodate a new multipolar world, because the rest of the world, even though they don't necessarily take Russia's position or empathize on what it's doing in Ukraine, they nonetheless see how the West have been trying to sabotage Chinese economy, how we're stealing Russian sovereign assets, and they're learning from this and seeing that this is not a reliable economic system. The West, as a declining collective hegemon, is becoming much more aggressive and using all our administrative control over the international economy to defeat rivals. So even countries who are very critical of Russian policies in Ukraine are nonetheless still embracing this Greater Eurasia initiative, and embracing also the idea of multipolarity, as they no longer want to live under this U.S. dominance. I think I spent my 20 minutes, so I'll just cut it there.
Lovely.